Welcome to ICPR 2026, our 7th major conference since 2010.
There's this invitation for you with psychedelics to actually step into a bigger consciousness.
I personally consider that ayahuasca saved my life.
I have seen now case studies only of women who have autoimmune disorders, often thyroid-related autoimmune disorders, which then affect their fertility, go into ceremony with ayahuasca and psilocybin, come out and see an almost instantaneous reduction in the autoimmune response that they are having. And I think that is incredible.
The psychedelics can abort an attack, they can stop you from having your cluster headache cycle, and they can prevent a cycle, depending on how you use them. And there's no other medicine like that.
The classic story of somebody with depression who struggled and tried a bunch of different treatments and psychotherapies and pills and nothing worked, and then they take psilocybin and then boom, their depression is lifted and they have this very meaningful experience, and the next day they're completely in remission, and that lasts for months and months and months. I've seen that many times. And it's extremely impressive. It's one of the most impressive things I've seen in psychiatry.
In 5 years, I would expect that at least some of these medicines will be part of the standard care and they will be fully reimbursed because it's working.
These experiences can help us recognize that some of the things about consciousness we might have taken for granted, we shouldn't take for granted.
Psychedelic can just maybe even give you some beliefs that you're this being that will, continue in some way, part of this fabric of the cosmos. And if you can get that visceral feeling of that through psychedelics, it's amazing.
You need roots to fly. If you don't have your roots, then you fly off. This is also what we do with Psych. We try to be this anchor for people. If they fly off, we try to meet them where they are and gently bring them back to the ground.
Open turns 20 next year. And in some ways, I think we're somewhere in the middle of adolescence. The field has grown fast, in spurts, faster than many of us anticipated or were even ready for. And in a way, we are still trying to figure out what kind of adults we will grow to be. ICPR brings together anthropologists, cognitive scientists, psychologists, philosophers, religious scholars, art critics, archivists, clinical researchers, psychiatrists, historians, and I'm no doubt skipping a whole bunch. But the academic side only paints one part of the picture. And for this reason, we also give a voice and a podium to people with lived experience, to trial participants. We are very grateful to have indigenous leaders from the Tukano, the Omagua, the Yepama sub peoples from Brazil, the Wirarica in Mexico, the Shipibo, Conibo, and Ashaninka in Peru, who will share not just their understanding of healing, but who will talk about the cultural, political, ecological, and spiritual dimensions of plant medicine use, like ayahuasca and peyote.
Eu sou uma das lideranças que defende as tradições milenares, a medicina, como por exemplo a ayahuasca. A minha vinda aqui é para cumprimentar a nova geração de ayahuasqueiros e desejar um bom sucesso. Assim, compreendendo a minha palavra, eles poderão defender melhor os povos indígenas que moram na Amazônia e que são ayahuasqueiros, defensores de muitas medicinas.
Do you feel that the knowledge and traditions of the indigenous people are kind of abused by some people in the north?
For sure, in many ways and by more people than we could imagine. We can also discuss the consumption of ayahuasca in the mechanical reproduction age. We're just trying to replicate and we're just trying to see the molecule and to create new remedies or new drugs or new pills, that we're forgetting about the whole cosmology. And I think it's fair to say that psychedelics, they are pluripotent. They can expand our minds, but in many different directions. And if you don't have the cosmology there, if you don't have the culture, if these ecstatic experiences, they are not rooted in something meaningful, they can harm people, they can damage people, and they can also culturally appropriate from indigenous systems of knowledge.
Is it your first time at ICPR?
Yes, it's my first time here.
How do you feel?
It's been great. I really like it, and I think for us, 2028, we'll definitely do a repeat. We'll be here again. I worked in academia for quite some time in research and moved into nonprofit world to help protect psychedelic medicines from companies and entities that are monopolizing the field through egregious, overly broad patenting of known compounds or practices that are already taught.
So you like to challenge some common misconceptions about psychedelics, and one of them is that psychedelics have been here for, I don't know, millennia and they are everywhere. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. There are, I think, 3 claims that you often see endorsed together. The first is that psychedelics have been used for millennia around the world and often in contexts of therapeutic healing. And I think each of these has elements that are accurate, but I think as a story it's quite misleading. There is ancient evidence of psychedelics, but it's very, very limited. You know, there are some snuff trays that go back several thousand years. There's some interesting evidence of peyote, but that's about it. You know, there's also a carving of San Pedro, but reliable evidence of old psychedelic use is very, very limited. And ancient or even recent indigenous evidence of psychedelic use is largely confined to just a couple places in the Americas, in Mexico, Central America, and South America.
So another misconception you challenge is the one that says that actually the modern clinical use and therapeutic use of psychedelics is a continuation of the ancient traditions, right? Can you explain that, please?
Yeah, I think sometimes in an effort to make the clinical application more palatable or more acceptable, people want to present it as an echo or a continuation of a traditional usage in which the shaman is something similar to a psychiatrist or psychotherapist who is administering this substance to a patient who then has a powerful experience, and that is a source of psychological healing. I think that is very infrequently the case. I think what's instead often the case is that in healing contexts, I think psychedelics are often seen as vehicles to achieving the kind of superhuman, especially for the specialist. The specialist might take a psychedelic to divine the source of an illness, you know, figure out which witches might be causing it. Or they might use the psychedelic to find lost objects. Or they might use the psychedelic to summon spirits and then use them to attack a neighboring group. I also think associated with that is the fact that in many contexts, psychedelics are not wholly positive, or the ends that people are trying to achieve with them are not wholly positive. Psychedelics are often deeply entangled with sorcery, with witchcraft, with aggression. They're used to identify who might be attacking you and to enter a state or to draw upon beings that can attack other people. And that's just to say that we should be careful about projecting narratives that are simplistic and convenient onto the world's traditions so we can justify our own political, ideological, economic goals. I think human culture is far more varied, far more nuanced, and far more gritty than sometimes we want it to be.
Sometimes you have, to have this kind of discussions, you really have to meet people in person, and there are not a lot of people that share that taste for things, about that specific thing around, so here you have all of them in the same room. It's beautiful.
So can you tell me what's the situation in Switzerland, how psychedelics are regulated?
In Switzerland is an exceptional medical use for a substance that is still considered a drug. So basically it's kind of a compassionate use, and you do it on case by case with LSD, MDMA and psilocybin.
Some people say that psychedelic-assisted therapy is one of the greatest innovation in pharmacotherapy in like many decades. What do you think about that?
The innovation for psychedelic therapy came out in the 50s. We are studying an old treatment that fell out of use and was never properly medicalized.
So what we see is more like a mainstreaming of old innovation. Do you think it will be mainstreamed?
I think it will be medicalized. Certainly, at least in the United States, we're seeing much broader adoption. I think about 12% of Americans have taken psilocybin, which is a very large number, but most people still regard psychedelics as this dangerous drug of abuse that has no benefit.
So where is it where psychedelics seem to really work?
Depression seems to be quite good. Treatment-resistant depression, less so. Smoking cessation, there's quite good evidence for that. And likely we can imagine that that will mean substance use disorders broadly. Other indications like PTSD remain to be seen, but I think also are likely to pan out.
What are the most cutting-edge research going on right now? What are those questions you think we need to answer in the next 5 years?
We still don't have an amazing idea of why they work. You know, people say, okay, well, this is catalyzing a psychologically beneficial experience that's akin to psychotherapy, and that seems to be true, but also, why is it effective immediately then? People talk about neuroplasticity, but then we actually don't really have any evidence of neuroplasticity of psychedelics in humans. And that's mostly because people have not looked. But then if that's true, there's non-psychiatric implications of that. You know, if psychedelics are really enhancing neuroplasticity, that should help me learn new languages. That should help me learn piano. That should help me maybe recover from stroke, which should help people with cochlear implants better able to hear. I think the human neuroplasticity question is the main cutting edge question in my mind.
There are a few explanations of how psychedelics work. For example, the entropic brain theory or the critical period hypothesis. Is there any what you favor?
The critical period reopening, which is work from Goldolin, I favor that mainly because it offers an explanation of why psychedelic therapy might work that can translate clinically. And it actually suggests things, if that's true, that we should be doing. So if there's a window of time post-psychedelic that's opened, maybe that's where you should be intervening. These lead to testable hypotheses. For example, Hopkins is doing work that's based on that. So I don't know if you heard of amblyopia, lazy eye. It's like when one eye is, they're not directly straight. This is something you can correct easily with a patch as a child, but as an adult, if you haven't corrected it, it's permanent. So they're running a study at Hopkins to see if psychedelics plus patch treatment can fix this. Essentially, it's a test of Goldolin's critical period reopening hypothesis.
So the first placebo-controlled trials on LSD microdosing were kind of sobering. How do you see microdosing? Can it be effective or?
I think that microdosing is probably not effective. I see it as psychedelic homeopathy, and it misses the bulk of what psychedelics are likely to be beneficial for. And there's been now 3 randomized trials of microdosing LSD or psilocybin in a clinical condition, and they've all been negative, or in fact, in one of them, placebo did better. People feel better, but it's just that people who take placebo also feel quite a bit better in those studies. And that's another example of a negative trial, right? Like, it's good that, okay, we've established the border. This will not actually work, and this is the region where we should be focusing.
The mind and the spirit coming, or at least trying to come together, is something that is really, really interesting. I'm enjoying the conference very much because I like the different perspectives. It's really interdisciplinary, so you can find many different points of view, cultural, sociological, but of course many interesting contemporary psychedelic research. So it's a great place to be.
As a psychiatrist, how do you see the potential of psychedelics in treating various mental health conditions?
I think it's very promising. This is, even though it might look weird and we are working with altered states of consciousness, that this is a way that could really help a lot of people, could be very cost effective, could save lives, and could improve the overall well-being of this population, which is really the most important thing. I have a patient that was in one of the first psilocybin trials. He's in his 70s and he was treated for 50 years with chronic depression. And after the psilocybin session, we asked him, how do you feel? And it was like, I never felt like that in my life. What are you asking me? I feel absolutely normal. This is unbelievable. And it lasted for about 6 months. And then he just gradually dropped down. And what he tried back again some antidepressants. It didn't work. So he decided to use mushrooms on his own with his wife that is kind of supervising him. So every 3 to 4 months he takes his mushroom dose, and now it's more than 4 years and he's okay. He has no depression, but we also see patients that simply do not respond or respond for a very short period of time, but still the content of the experience was somehow important for them and can improve their quality of life in general. So it seems to me that they never get back to such a low state as they were before the intervention.
So why do you find this so fascinating, couples therapy and MDMA?
I do treatment development research, particularly with MDMA-assisted couples therapy, to be able to go to places in ourselves that are really difficult and face things that are really hard and have difficult conversations together. I believe in the power of that, and I believe also in the power that relationships can help us heal, but also that we can heal our relationships. So both of those aspects or angles. And then the idea of adding MDMA to that possibility can help us be open and have empathy for each other and be able to actually listen in a different way when we're not as activated. Because when we're having difficulties in our relationship, all the alarm bells are going off and we can be defensive, or we can want to run away from the situation, or we want to fight. And what the MDMA can do is help us stay present. It can help us feel everything we need to feel, but in a way that we are able to continue to be there together.
It is always very humbling to see what we all don't know yet and what answers we don't have yet. And that's also why it's so important, and what's really at the core of Pink Elephant for us is to do this together, to learn from each other and to do it in a collaborative manner.
What about the biological differences and hormonal differences that can shape the psychedelic experience for women and men?
There's a fundamental flaw in all of the clinical trials that we have done, and that is that most women who do go into clinical trials, if they are of childbearing age, which most of them are, they are required to be on a certain number of effective contraceptive methods. Now, usually that means hormonal contraceptives. Now, what that does is it means that the natural fluctuations of hormones that a woman has are now blunted. And so that person, that female in the trial, has a much more stable mental state from being on these drugs, these hormonal contraceptives, but it means that their experience and their changes in their experience is going to look different from a woman who isn't on hormonal contraceptives.
Beyond the biological and hormonal level, are there differences between the experiences of women and men, how they perceive and report the psychedelic experiences?
We know that there are differences in female psychology to men, but there are also these huge differences in sociology, where we need to think about an environment that might feel safe to a man might not feel safe to a woman. So how can we ensure that women feel as safe? That's one of the things that we have to consider. But how also can we relate our psychedelic experiences and the meaning we make from them for things that are very specific to women? So to give a few examples, I think it's really important anybody facilitating psychedelic experiences for women is well aware that it's quite common for women to have a lot of their experience be about reproduction and be about, their fertility, be about potential pregnancies they've had, maybe if they've had a miscarriage or an abortion. These can really often come up in psychedelic experiences, things that maybe they never thought was something that bothered them or they needed to process now suddenly is very real and very there. And it needs to be handled with incredible care. And then when you start to think about women who have, given birth, for instance, once you've had a birthing experience, which is a very psychedelic experience in itself, well, then you're contextualizing whatever happened in your psychedelic experience against that. And one of the common questions in a lot of these mystical experience questionnaires is, was this the most profound thing that's ever happened to you? Well, if you ask that to a man, he might say yes. But if you ask that to a woman who's given birth to a child, then maybe it is not as profound as that experience. And so we need to have slightly different views and thinking about it. And actually, I just had a great conversation with somebody just now who said that they found that they'd done a lot of psychedelics and then they gave birth, and actually the experience of having done psychedelics made the birth process easier because they've already lived through the experience of being like, okay, I will get through this, I just need to trust and let go and go with it, you know, and they found that their birthing experience was far better knowing all of the things that they knew from a psychedelic experience. So yeah, they certainly are different.
We are a naturally derived psychoactive compound manufacturer in Southern Africa, so I don't get out of the laboratory very often. We can provide raw mushrooms, we can provide total alkaloid solutions, we can provide refined clinical ready solutions.
You are quite open about your own migraine, and your first book was about migraine. Can you talk about what we don't know about migraine and what are the common misconceptions about it?
Migraine's very common. It affects probably about 12% of people in the world, and for women, way more. So it's like maybe 18% of women, adult women. Cluster headache is a much more severe disease than migraine. It is extremely painful. Every attack is like a medical emergency. That's how painful it is. People are being given medications that make them feel sick, that don't work. They get like their teeth extracted, they get sinus surgeries. One of the greatest treatments we have is high flow oxygen. You have to carry around this big tank.
So these people were desperate to find new ways to alleviate pain. What were their experiences with psychedelics?
One of the mottos in the group is psychedelics or suicide. That's how they see it. So their experience with psychedelics is usually that it's their last choice. Very often the people I've met were people who'd never done an illegal drug before. They were often very frightened to do it. They're taught to take a very small amount at first, maybe like half a gram of dried mushrooms, see how it goes, slowly increase. They're given a lot of safety information. And for the most part, people say it works better than anything else that they've ever tried. They'll say it's like their head cleared for the first time. And for those people who don't have a very intractable form of episodic headache, something like 3 doses can prevent another cycle for 6 months.
It's amazing. And does the research support this?
The research has supported this since 1963. So Sandoz have been making migraine medicine since 1925. Arthur Stoll developed ergotamine, which was known to be used for migraine. Albert Hofmann in 1943, same year he's riding that bicycle, he and his boss developed dihydroergotamine. See, these are all ergot derivatives. The biochemistry's been there all along.
So it's interesting that with most conditions, psychedelics work through the integration of the psychedelic experience, but this seems to be different. Like this is not about the experience, but it's some kind of biological process through that works, right?
Yeah, a lot of the debates that happen in psychedelic medicine are about how much does consciousness matter versus the molecule. When you look at it from the perspective of cluster headache, that debate it's been settled. So for cluster headache, for this particular disorder, it's about the molecule. I will say though, and this comes from the patients, for some people, they take mushrooms, they feel better for a long time. But for a lot of people who don't, they still find LSD and mushrooms and these classic psychedelics helpful. And for those people, I think the trip is actually really helpful because it helps give them cognitive space in which to process the pain. Having the ability to grow mushrooms in your home is the most magical thing that there is about psychedelics for this community. It's cheap, it's easy, it's accessible. They can learn how to do it online. It can change their lives, it can save their lives. So in terms of harm reduction, a little bit of psilocybin being grown in your house goes a very long way.
it's very good to be in touch with what's going on and see all these rigorous scientists doing their work, which is very, very impressive. I think it's difficult to do academic work so rigorously, particularly in a field that is a bit controversial.
Do you think it's just simply different or distorted way of perceiving reality, or is there a kind of higher intelligence behind it? Or is it a superior type of experiencing reality?
I think it's a different kind of intelligence. It's an extraordinary amount of sort of intuitive intelligence that emerges during psychedelics. It's the brain's best guesses sometimes about what's going on, or maybe even working in tandem with other, you really don't know, potentially, other nervous systems like in your gut and things. Yeah, I think the substrate of consciousness ultimately is to do with the electromagnetic field, which goes across the whole universe. And that's got a complex configuration inside my head and a complex configuration inside your head. And in between us, it's flat, so there's nothing unified there. So you experience your stuff and I experience my stuff. But ultimately, it's the universe experiencing both, and yeah, both will be experienced. We don't even have adequate vocabulary to describe this, but yeah, it will all be experienced at some point. I think there's a really interesting interplay here between thinking this is likely by studying the science, which I think this is likely, just, I've reached there intellectually, not through taking psychedelics. But yeah, it's very hard to kind of, really believe that because it's so counter to natural, normal, ordinary state of consciousness. Then taking psychedelics and feeling that viscerally that something like this might be true, that's very useful as well.
I think one has to be conservative and sort of parsimonious. So the most parsimonious way to think about psychedelic experiences for me is indeed as distortions of the machinery that underpins normal everyday experience. I think we take psychedelic experiences seriously, and they're very, very informative about the space of possible experiences someone can have. But that doesn't mean we have to take them literally. So for instance, if people experience that consciousness is everywhere and it's fundamental to the universe, if that's the content of the psychedelic experience, I think that says absolutely nothing about whether that's in fact the case. That's information about the kind of experience someone can have. It doesn't tell us anything about whether panpsychism is actually true or not.
How can they heal then? How can they help people with a serious mental condition?
The slogan in the psychedelic world is it shakes the snow globe. It breaks our perceptual habits of experiencing things in a particular way. Now we walk around the world generally under the spell of this naive realism, that the way we see things is the way they are. We already know, well, I think that's not true, and we don't need psychedelics to know that. That's just the working perception tells us that. But it means we can get stuck into these ways of experiencing the world, the self, and just revealing that things can change, I think potentially holds therapeutic value. This is why in our group at Sussex we're pursuing this work with stroboscopic light. Now this is not a psychedelic, it's not a drug at all. The hallucinations that people have in these dream machines, these stroboscopic situations, they kind of have the character of like, oh, my brain is doing this. And so that too can open a bit of space to allow people to recognize that how things seem is not always how they are.
I work with drug education and harm reduction, particularly in the rave culture and the underground scene. I go primarily here for networking.
Some people think that this psychedelic field is growing or increasingly medicalized and they don't find their place in this world. How do you feel about this?
We have formulated a medical model that takes all of the mystery out of psychedelic medicine so that we can target a specific symptom and restore someone to function. And I think that is actually an incredibly limited view of what psychedelics can do. My view is that there is very deep reasons to have a relationship with the sacred and the divine that are outside of treatment goals. I also, myself, had treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder. I tried many different kinds of therapies that were pretty unhelpful. I got invited to my first ayahuasca ceremony, and that was really the thing that changed my life. I always thought it was kind of irritating as a trauma survivor when people would talk about embodiment, because I thought, well, where else would I be if I wasn't in a human body? I'm in a body. And you don't realize how disembodied you are until you are completely turned on to the somatic experience of feeling so good in your personhood. So I remember that day of just falling in love with the world and feeling so alive and feeling so much pleasure. And when I talk about pleasure in my clinical and I suppose you'd say philosophical psychedelic work, I'm talking about it really specifically. What is really healing is when we link positive affect and sensation with the quality of aliveness and mindfulness. So this quality of savoring the sensual and being very alive in the world, I think psychedelics can deliver that to us or support us in that in a way that few other things can.
What motivated you to leave the promising academic career behind and join an NGO and found a harm reduction group?
I have volunteered at Cosmic Care at Boom Festival quite some time, and there I saw really how what happens when shit hits the fan. And before I was a bit in this like honeymoon phase of psychedelics, you know, amazing, all the research, very promising. And there I was on the ground, hands-on, seeing what can go wrong when you have 40,000 people at a festival for 7 days, very, very hot weather, and everyone together having their experiences, but also what you can do to make them move through it, and how with sometimes very simple interventions, you can get them out of their craziness or difficulties and calm again.
So how can you help those people?
Yeah, so at the moment when someone is in a challenging state or experiencing discomfort, we cannot change what they took. Well, we can try to change their mindset, but it's more difficult. So we focus on changing the setting at first. So really, a psych facility is a place, a physical place at a festival where people can go to, where we try to make a really calm and nice and easy environment. So actually what you want is that someone in a state like this comes to a psych and is like, oh, this is nice. Oh, a nice chair, oh, maybe a blanket, oh, a cup of tea, someone with a listening ear, and just really to slow them down.
If you can think about an ideal regulation of psychedelic drugs, how should society treat these substances? What would that be?
Neither extreme is good. Total, denial is not good. And total freedom, I think, is also not good. I don't think it's good to have them freely available to everybody. You're going to have children using it. You're going to have people with serious psychiatric issues. It's going to be a cost to society if things go wrong, or else you'll get these movements like they had in the 60s that they said everybody should use it for everything, and that didn't end well. So what kind of level of regulation? I guess two contexts. One is available for in medical context for people who are trying to address a psychiatric problem or a life issue. And then also separate from that, a context where people could use it for exploration. I think both of them, I would like to see them be protected in some way or guided or have some sort of either cultural or regulatory control over how people use it.